The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawns of Gossington Hall, where the annual St. Mary Mead Flower Show had transformed the grounds into a tapestry of colour and gentle competition. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly on a wooden bench beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of decades of practice. To the casual observer, she appeared entirely absorbed in the delicate pink baby blanket taking shape in her lap, but her sharp blue eyes missed nothing of the small drama unfolding around the refreshment tent. The centerpiece of this year's show was not, as one might expect, the prize-winning roses or the spectacular dahlia display, but rather an exquisite piece of royal Worcester porcelain that graced the main exhibition table. The ornament, a delicate shepherdess figurine in soft pastels with gold leaf detailing, had been donated for the charity auction by Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who could be heard explaining its provenance to anyone within earshot. 18th century, my dears, Mrs. Bantry announced with considerable satisfaction to a small gathering that included the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, and the recently arrived Mrs. Hartnell. It belonged to my great-aunt Cordelia, who had the most discerning taste in such matters. The auctioneer in Much Benham valued it at quite a substantial sum, though naturally one doesn't discuss such vulgar details. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly as she observed the way Mr. Raymond West's new neighbour, a sharp-eyed gentleman who had introduced himself as Mr. Reginald Fortescue, studied the figurine with what seemed like professional interest. Mr. Fortescue had moved to the village only 3 months prior, claiming to be a retired businessman seeking the peace of country life, though his hands bore the telltale stains that suggested a more intimate acquaintance with antiques and restoration work. Quite remarkable craftsmanship, Mr. Fortescue murmured, leaning closer to examine the piece. The detail work on the base is particularly fine. One doesn't often see such quality outside of museum collections. Mrs. Bantry preened at the compliment, though Miss Marple noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. Yes, well, Great-Aunt Cordelia did have connections with some of the finest dealers in London before the war. The conversation was interrupted by a sudden commotion near the tea tent, where young Tommy Bond, the baker's son, had collided with Miss Weatherby while chasing after a wayward cricket ball. The collision sent Miss Weatherby stumbling backward, her flailing arm catching the edge of the exhibition table. The Royal Worcester shepherdess rocked precariously on its stand, teetering for a heart-stopping moment before Mr. Fortescue's quick reflexes saved it from disaster. "Steady on," he said with a nervous laugh, carefully repositioning the figurine. That was rather too close for comfort. Mrs. Bantry's face had gone quite pale. "Thank heavens for your quick thinking, Mr. Fortescue. I should never have forgiven myself if anything had happened to dear Cordelia's treasure." Miss Marple had observed the entire incident with the quiet attention she brought to all of life's small dramas. Something about the way Mr. Fortescue had handled the piece, the confidence of his grip, the practiced ease with which he had examined its base while steadying it, struck her as noteworthy. She also couldn't help but notice that Mrs. Bantry's relief seemed tinged with something that might have been guilt, though about what, she couldn't say. As the afternoon progressed, the flower show continued its pleasant course. The judging of the vegetable competition had been completed, Colonel Melchett's marrows taking first prize for the 3rd consecutive year, and the ladies of the Women's Institute were preparing for the traditional afternoon tea service. Miss Marple had been persuaded to judge the children's flower arrangement contest, a task she approached with the same gentle thoroughness she brought to all her observations of human nature. It was during the tea service that the second incident occurred. Mrs. Bantry had insisted that the Royal Worcester shepherdess be moved to a more prominent position on the main refreshment table, where it could be better admired by potential bidders. Mr. Fortescue had volunteered to handle the delicate transfer, despite Mrs. Bantry's obvious nervousness about allowing anyone else to touch her precious ornament. The disaster happened with the swift inevitability of a Greek tragedy. As Mr. Fortescue lifted the figurine from its display stand, Mrs. Hartnell's enthusiastic gesturing while recounting a story about her prize-winning sweet peas caused her to bump into his elbow. This time, There were no quick reflexes to save the day. The shepherdess fell from Mr. Fortescue's startled grasp, striking the edge of the wooden table with a sickening crack before shattering into several pieces on the grass below. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Mrs. Bantry stared at the fragments of porcelain scattered at her feet, her face cycling through expressions of shock, disbelief, and something that looked remarkably like relief before settling into appropriate devastation. "Oh, my dear Mrs. Bantry," Mrs. Hartnell gasped, her hands pressed to her cheeks. "I am so terribly, terribly sorry. However can I make amends for such clumsiness?" But it was not Mrs. Hartnell's distress that caught Miss Marple's attention. Rather, it was the way Mr. Fortescue was staring at the broken pieces with an expression of puzzled concentration, as if the fragments had revealed something unexpected. He knelt down and carefully picked up the largest piece, the shepherdess's torso, turning it over in his hands with the careful attention of a man accustomed to examining such things closely. "Most peculiar," he murmured, so quietly that only Miss Marple, who had approached to offer comfort to the distraught Mrs. Bantry, could hear him. "What's peculiar, Mr. Fortescue?" Miss Marple asked in her gentle way, her knitting forgotten in her lap. He looked up at her with the expression of a man who had discovered something he wished he hadn't. "The paste, Miss Marple. The composition of the ceramic. This piece—" He hesitated, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "This piece isn't 18th century Royal Worcester. It's a rather good reproduction, but modern. Very modern indeed." Miss Marple felt that familiar tingle of interest that always accompanied the discovery of something not quite as it seemed. "Are you quite certain, Mr. Fortescue?" "Quite certain, I'm afraid. You see, I spent 30 years in the antiques trade before my retirement. The clay composition, the glazing technique, even the style of the gold leaf application, they're all characteristic of contemporary reproduction work. Very fine work, mind you, but reproduction nonetheless." As Miss Marple absorbed this information, she became aware that their quiet conversation had not gone entirely unnoticed. Mrs. Bantry, who had been accepting condolences from the other ladies, had gone very still, her face now quite pale indeed. And there, at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered around the broken ornament, stood Dr. Haydock with an expression of professional concern that seemed to have very little to do with broken porcelain and a great deal to do with the woman who had claimed it as a family heirloom. The peaceful afternoon of the St. Mary Mead Flower Show had taken on an entirely different character, and Miss Marple found herself contemplating the curious case of an ornament that had fallen twice, once nearly to disaster and once to revelation. As she carefully gathered the fragments of what had been presented as a precious antique, she couldn't help but wonder what other carefully constructed facades might be hiding more dangerous deceptions. The ornament had indeed fallen twice, but Miss Marple suspected that the real drama was only just beginning. By evening, the news of Mrs. Bantry's heirloom had traveled through St. Mary Mead with the swift efficiency that only village gossip could achieve. At the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley was heard declaring that she had always suspected something wasn't quite right about that shepherdess. While at the grocer's, young Mrs. Clement was defending Mrs. Bantry with the fierce loyalty of the Women's Institute. The baker's wife had her own theory involving London dealers and wartime confusion, and even the vicar found himself drawn into speculation about the provenance of parish donations. Miss Marple, who had remained to help with the clearing away, though her assistance consisted mainly of observing while others did the physical work, noticed several things that the spreading gossip had not yet seized upon. Mr. Fortescue had made no fewer than 3 attempts to volunteer his services regarding the fragments, each time offering to examine them more thoroughly for Mrs. Bantry's peace of mind. Each offer had been politely but firmly declined, first by Mrs. Bantry herself, then by Mrs. Clement, who had taken charge of securing the pieces in the church hall cupboard. "Safer there until Monday," Mrs. Clement had declared with characteristic efficiency, We'll need to discuss this properly with the committee." Dr. Haydock approached Miss Marple as the last of the trestle tables were being folded away. His weathered face bore the expression of a man who had spent decades reading the subtle signs of human distress, and his concern was evident. "She's more frightened than grieved," he murmured, nodding toward Mrs. Bantry, who sat on a folding chair accepting condolences with mechanical politeness. "There's something she's not telling us, Jane, something that has her genuinely worried." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "People often know more about their possessions than they care to admit, Doctor, especially when those possessions come with complicated histories." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who had been enjoying what he had hoped would be a peaceful Saturday off-duty. His expression suggested that the appearance of anything resembling a mystery at a village social event was precisely the sort of complication he had hoped to avoid. "Now then," he said with weary authority, "what's all this about suspicious circumstances and broken crockery? Mrs. Bantry's been telling everyone it was just an unfortunate accident." Mr. Fortescue, still examining the largest fragment with professional interest, looked up reluctantly. "I'm afraid it's rather more significant than that, Inspector. The piece that broke, it wasn't the 18th century Royal Worcester that Mrs. Bantry believed it to be. It's a modern reproduction, quite skillfully made, but definitely contemporary work." Inspector Slack's attention sharpened considerably. "Mrs. Bantry, perhaps you'd care to explain how you came to possess this reproduction." Mrs. Bantry's composure, which had been wavering all afternoon, finally cracked entirely. "I received it 3 months ago," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze, "in a package with a note signed simply, 'A friend.' It said that Great-Aunt Cordelia would have wanted me to have it for the church fund." The admission hung in the air like a confession, and Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her with renewed interest. Tommy Bond, who had been hovering nearby with the guilty fascination of a child who knows he has caused trouble, suddenly piped up. "It made a funny sound when it broke, miss," he said to Miss Marple. "Not like when our good china breaks. Sort of dull, like." Miss Marple smiled at him gently. "Did it indeed, Tommy? How very observant of you." As the group began to disperse, Miss Marple made one final observation that she kept to herself. The velvet cloth where the shepherdess had originally been displayed showed a faint ring, slightly larger than the base of the broken ornament. Someone had been very careful about positioning, as if they had wanted to ensure the piece would be displayed to its best advantage. Or perhaps, she reflected, to ensure it would be noticed by exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. The ornament had indeed fallen twice, but Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that both falls had been more carefully orchestrated than anyone yet realized. The following morning brought the gentle rhythms of Sunday to St. Mary Mead, though Miss Marple noticed that the usual post-service conversations carried an undercurrent of speculation that had nothing to do with the vicar's sermon on truth and charity. She had arrived early at the church hall, ostensibly to help Mrs. Clement with the flower arrangements, but in reality to examine more closely the scene of yesterday's revelation. The exhibition area had been cleared, but the velvet cloth still lay folded on the side table where it had been hastily gathered after the incident. Miss Marple's experienced fingers detected something that had escaped notice in the confusion of the previous afternoon. A faint grittiness along one edge of the fabric, and caught in its folds a thin circle of felt that had been cut with precision and showed traces of dried adhesive. "How very interesting," she murmured to herself, slipping the felt ring into her knitting bag. Someone had taken considerable care to ensure that the shepherdess would sit just so on its display cloth. Or perhaps, she reflected, to ensure that it wouldn't sit quite securely enough to survive an accidental jostle. Mrs. Clement bustled in with an armful of late roses, her face bearing the expression of someone bursting with theories. "Miss Marple, I've been thinking about yesterday's business all night. That Mr. Fortescue seemed remarkably quick to identify the piece as a reproduction, didn't he? almost as if he'd been expecting it. Professional expertise can be quite revealing, Miss Marple agreed mildly, her needles beginning their familiar rhythm. Though I suppose one might wonder why a retired antiques dealer would choose our quiet village for his retirement. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, whose usual Sunday morning cheerfulness was notably absent. "Ladies, I'm afraid there's been another development. Mrs. Bantry telephoned just now. There's been a break-in at Gossington Cottage." The three of them hurried through the village streets, where they found Inspector Slack already taking charge of the scene with his characteristic blend of efficiency and irritation at having his Sunday disrupted. Mrs. Bantry stood in her doorway, wrapped in a dressing gown and looking far more distressed than she had the previous day. The sitting room told its own story of systematic search. Drawers pulled open, papers scattered, cushions overturned. Yet Miss Marple noticed immediately that the disturbance was oddly selective. The valuable silver remained untouched on the mantelpiece, and Mrs. Bantry's jewelry box sat undisturbed on the side table. "Nothing of obvious value seems to be missing," Inspector Slack was noting in his methodical way. "Suggests they were looking for something specific." Mrs. Bantry's voice trembled as she explained. "They went through everything so thoroughly, every drawer, every cupboard. But the strangest thing is—" She paused, glancing around the assembled group. "The letter that came with the shepherdess, the one signed 'A Friend,' it's gone. I kept it in my writing desk, and now it's simply vanished." Miss Marple exchanged a significant glance with Dr. Haydock. The removal of that particular document suggested that someone was very anxious indeed to eliminate any trace of how the reproduction had found its way to Mrs. Bantry. "Mrs. Bantry," Miss Marple said gently, "this letter, did it contain anything beyond the simple note about your great-aunt's wishes?" "It was quite detailed, actually," Mrs. Bantry replied, her voice growing stronger as she focused on the memory. "It mentioned that Great-Aunt Cordelia had been forced to sell the piece in the 20s to settle some debts, but that the writer had discovered it in a London dealer's shop and purchased it back for the family. There were even details about the original purchase, dates, the dealer's name, that sort of thing. All of which could be verified," Dr. Haydock observed quietly. "Precisely," Miss Marple murmured, "and all of which would be extremely inconvenient for someone if those details proved to be fabricated." As they prepared to leave Mrs. Bantry in the capable hands of Inspector Slack, Miss Marple noticed Mr. Fortescue approaching along the lane. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of a restless night, and his hands, she observed with interest, bore traces of what appeared to be clay or plaster dust. The ornament had indeed fallen twice, but Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that its destruction had been merely the opening move in a much more complex and dangerous game. One that required the elimination of inconvenient evidence and the silencing of uncomfortable questions. Mr. Fortescue's arrival at the scene struck Miss Marple as remarkably convenient timing, particularly given the faint traces of clay dust still visible on his hands, despite what appeared to be a hasty attempt to clean them. His expression of neighborly concern seemed genuine enough, but she noticed how his eyes swept the cottage's exterior with what looked distinctly like professional assessment. "Dreadful business," he said, addressing Inspector Slack with helpful earnestness. "I do hope nothing of significant value was taken, though I suppose whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for." Inspector Slack's attention sharpened immediately. "Interesting observation, Mr. Fortescue. Been doing some repair work this morning, have you?" He nodded toward the telltale dust on the man's cuffs. "A small restoration project," Fortescue replied smoothly. "Old habits from my antiques days. I was experimenting with some bonding compounds when I heard about the break-in." He paused, then added with what seemed like casual helpfulness, "Actually, I may have seen something relevant last evening. Around 10 o'clock, I noticed a light moving near the church lane. Looked like a lantern to me." Mrs. Clement, who had been listening intently, spoke up immediately. "A lantern? But the verger doesn't use one. We replaced all the electric bulbs in the church hall just last month." The implication hung in the air like morning mist, and Miss Marple filed away, both the information and Fortescue's quick glance toward Mrs. Clement when she contradicted his assumption about the verger's habits. "We should examine those fragments more carefully," Inspector Slack decided. "Mrs. Clement, if you'd unlock the church hall cupboard." The small procession made its way to the hall, where Mrs. Clement produced her keys with efficient authority. But when she opened the cupboard door, her sharp intake of breath told its own story before anyone could see inside. "The base," she whispered, staring at the tissue-lined tray where the fragments lay. "The circular footpiece. It's gone." Miss Marple stepped closer, her trained eye taking in details that the others missed in their shock. Where the base had lain, a clean circular depression remained in the tissue paper, and scattered around it were grains of a pale, gritty substance quite different from porcelain dust. More telling still was a tiny crescent of deep red wax caught in the tissue fold. Sealing wax, she realized, the kind used to secure hidden compartments. "Most illuminating," Fortescue murmured, leaning forward with barely concealed eagerness. "The base would naturally contain any maker's marks. And if our reproduction concealed anything, it would have been sealed into the hollow foot." His expertise was revealing itself again, Miss Marple noted, along with his assumption that the piece had indeed concealed something. She quietly palmed the wax fragment while examining the cupboard lock, which showed no signs of forcing. "Only Mrs. Clement and the vicar have keys," Inspector Slack observed grimly, "though I suppose others might have had access during yesterday's clearing up." As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple made a small detour to examine the side door of the hall. Fresh scratches marked the paint around the latch, and on the flagstones lay more of that distinctive pale grit. Most interesting of all, the dew on the grass strip showed clear tire marks leading to the lane. Not the narrow tracks of a bicycle, but the broader impression of a wheelbarrow or cart. Walking back through the village with Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple shared her observations in her characteristically gentle way. "The missing base suggests someone knew exactly what they were looking for," she mused, "and the sealing wax indicates they found it, though I can't help wondering why they waited until after the piece was broken to retrieve it." "Perhaps," Dr. Haydock suggested thoughtfully, "they needed the accident to provide cover for their real purpose. A broken ornament draws attention away from what might be hidden inside it." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she considered the implications. The ornament had indeed fallen twice, once to reveal its false nature and once to conceal its true purpose. But she was beginning to suspect that both falls had been carefully orchestrated by someone who understood that the best place to hide a secret was often in plain sight, surrounded by the chaos of an apparent accident. The question now was not who had taken the base, but what had been hidden inside it, and why someone was willing to commit burglary to retrieve it. That afternoon brought a peculiar stillness to St. Mary Mead, the kind that settles over a village when everyone is thinking the same unspoken thoughts. Miss Marple returned to the church hall, ostensibly to help Mrs. Clement with the remaining cleanup, but in reality to conduct a more thorough examination of what the hurried official investigation had left behind. Kneeling beside the cupboard where the fragments had been stored, she studied the pale grit scattered across the tissue paper with the focused attention of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. The substance had a distinctive crystalline quality that reminded her of something from her considerable experience with village craftsmen. It wasn't ordinary ceramic dust, but rather bore the characteristics of finely crushed marble mixed with Portland cement, the specialized compound old Mr. Ponsonby had used for his ecclesiastical restoration work before his death 2 years prior. The crescent of sealing wax she had pocketed proved equally revealing under closer inspection. Its deep oxblood color and substantial thickness suggested quality far superior to modern varieties. This was the type of wax used for important documents, the kind that spoke of old families and significant correspondence. She recalled seeing similar wax on letters in the late Canon Prescott's collection, which had been donated to the parish archives. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Price Ridley, who approached with the purposeful stride of someone bearing important intelligence. "Miss Marple, I've been observing Mr. Fortescue's cottage all morning. Most peculiar activity, smoke rising from what appears to be a small kiln in his workshop, and he's been wheeling something heavy about his garden, wrapped in canvas." This information aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's growing suspicions about their retired antiques dealer. She made her way to Gossington Cottage, where she found Mrs. Bantry in a state of considerable agitation, polishing silver with the mechanical intensity of someone trying to restore order to more than just household objects. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bantry began, before her visitor had even settled into her chair. "The most extraordinary thing has happened. A gentleman from Harrod's Antiquities Department came to see me. He brought photographs of Great-Aunt Cordelia's actual collection, which was sold at auction in 1923. Her voice dropped to a whisper. There was never any shepherdess. Great-Aunt Cordelia collected Staffordshire pottery exclusively. Miss Marple's needles began their familiar rhythm as she absorbed this revelation. Someone had constructed not merely a false ornament, but an elaborate fictional provenance to accompany it. The letter that came with the piece, my dear, you mentioned it contained quite specific details about the dealer and dates." "Oh, yes. Very precise. The dealer was Finch & Sons, and the original sale was dated 1927, with the repurchase just a few months ago." Mrs. Bantry's hands twisted in her lap. "I must confess, Miss Marple, I came to St. Mary Mead 7 years ago after some financial difficulties. Nothing dishonest, you understand. Just unfortunate investments." Miss Marple filed away both pieces of information with equal interest. Finch & Sons had been a highly reputable firm, but one that had closed its doors decades ago, long before any recent repurchase could have occurred. The anachronism was subtle but telling, the kind of historical inconsistency that would pass unnoticed by most, but stood out like a discordant note to someone with Miss Marple's encyclopedic knowledge of such matters. Dr. Haydock's arrival brought news that cast the entire affair in an even more serious light. "Ladies, Inspector Slack has received a telephone call from London. There's been a significant theft from a private collection. Several valuable items, including documents and a Royal Worcester shepherdess, matching your piece's description, Mrs. Bantry." The silence that followed was profound and telling. Mrs. Bantry had gone quite pale, and Miss Marple found herself studying her neighbour's face with the careful attention she brought to all puzzles of human nature. The theft, the false provenance, the missing letter, and now the revelation about Great-Aunt Cordelia's actual collecting habits, all these elements were weaving themselves into a pattern that suggested something far more complex than a simple case of mistaken identity. The ornament had indeed fallen twice, but Miss Marple was beginning to understand that its destruction had been merely the visible conclusion of a carefully orchestrated deception involving stolen goods, false documentation, and identities that were not quite what they seemed. The revelation of the London theft had transformed what seemed like a village curiosity into something far more sinister. Miss Marple found herself drawn to make a neighbourly call on Mr. Fortescue, armed with a jar of her famous quince jelly and the kind of gentle curiosity that had served her well in understanding the complexities of human nature. Mr. Fortescue answered his door with the alacrity of someone who had been waiting, though whether for visitors or news, she couldn't say. His cottage bore the telltale signs of recent industry, a faint haze of heat from what was clearly a workshop area, and the distinctive scent of cooling wax mingled with something more industrial. "How thoughtful, Miss Marple," he said, accepting the jelly with practiced charm. "I was just tidying up some restoration work. Old habits, you know." Miss Marple's trained eye took in the details he perhaps hoped she wouldn't notice. A small punch tool designed for cutting precise circles, a shallow dish containing the same pale grit she had found in the church hall, and most tellingly, a stick of oxblood sealing wax with its end recently softened. Near the door, a wheelbarrow showed traces of that distinctive marble dust along its rim. Such satisfying work. Restoration, she observed mildly. You were most helpful yesterday in identifying the shepherdess as a reproduction. Not everyone would have recognized it so quickly. His smile carried the confidence of expertise. 30 years in the trade develops the eye, Miss Marple. As it happens, I saw the late edition of the Telegraph this morning. Mentioned a theft in London, a shepherdess among other items. Miss Marple, who had confirmed at the post office that no late edition had yet reached St. Mary Mead, simply nodded with interest. How efficient our postal service has become. After taking her leave, she encountered Mrs. Hartnell near the village green, who provided a crucial piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple, I've been thinking about yesterday's accident. When Mr. Fortescue caught the shepherdess during that first stumble, he examined the base quite thoroughly before setting it back, almost as if he were confirming something. This observation crystallized Miss Marple's growing understanding. The first near fall hadn't been mere accident, it had been reconnaissance, allowing someone to verify the contents of the hollow base before arranging for its deliberate destruction and subsequent theft. Inspector Slack's return from his telephone consultations brought additional illumination. The London theft had involved not merely the Royal Worcester shepherdess, but several important documents from the collection of elderly Mrs. Ashford. Property deeds, mineral rights, that sort of thing, he explained to the assembled group at the vicarage. Some dating back to disputed sales in the 1920s. The family's been fighting legal challenges for years. Mrs. Clement, ever observant of village comings and goings, added her own piece to the puzzle. When Mr. Fortescue arrived 3 months ago, he made quite a study of local history, particularly interested in the old families and their property connections. The timing was indeed suggestive. Miss Marple recalled how thoroughly their new neighbor had researched local genealogies, knowledge that had seemed impressive for a recent arrival, but now appeared calculated for more specific purposes. Dr. Haydock's arrival brought the news that confirmed her suspicions. Fortescue's departed rather suddenly, he announced, left word with Mrs. Jameson about urgent London business. As Miss Marple walked home through the lengthening shadows, she reflected on the elegant complexity of the scheme that was revealing itself. Someone had stolen valuable documents along with the shepherdess, created an elaborate reproduction to serve as a hiding place for those papers, and arranged for the false ornament to reach precisely the person who might have legitimate claim to whatever those documents contained. The theft of the letter with its fabricated provenance, the careful timing of the ornament's destruction, and the subsequent removal of the base, all had been orchestrated with the precision of a theatrical performance. The ornament had indeed fallen twice, but Miss Marple now understood that both falls had been carefully choreographed moments in a larger drama involving stolen documents, disputed property rights, and identities that were not quite what they seemed. The question now was whether Mr. Fortescue was the mastermind of this deception or merely another player in someone else's more elaborate game. Evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with the particular stillness that follows revelation, when secrets hover just beneath the surface of ordinary village life. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm, while her mind worked through the pattern of deception that was slowly revealing itself. Through her window, she could see the soft glow of lamplight in cottage windows, but it was the absence of light from Mr. Fortescue's workshop that drew her attention most particularly. Dr. Haydock's arrival brought news that cast their departed neighbour in an entirely different light. Jane, Inspector Slack has received some disturbing information from London. The real Reginald Fortescue died in Brighton 6 months ago. Our antiques expert has been living under an assumed identity. Miss Marple's needles paused thoughtfully. How very illuminating, Doctor. One might wonder what necessity drove someone to adopt the identity of a deceased antiques dealer, and why they chose to settle in our particular village. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps on the garden path. Mrs. Clement appeared at the door, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of considerable agitation. "Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, you must come at once. There's been another incident at the church. Someone's been at the parish records." The three of them made their way through the village streets, where they found Inspector Slack already examining the scene with his characteristic thoroughness. The church hall bore signs of careful but systematic searching, not the random destruction of vandalism, but the methodical work of someone seeking specific information. "The old records cupboard has been forced," Inspector Slack reported grimly. "Canon Prescott's collection of historical documents, particularly those concerning local property disputes from the 1920s. Several files are missing entirely." Miss Marple examined the damaged lock with interest, noting the precision of the tool marks and the absence of any unnecessary damage. "Someone knew exactly what they were looking for," she observed mildly, "and they possessed the proper tools for the task." Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the scattered papers, held up a partially burned document. "This appears to be correspondence about disputed land sales. The letterhead mentions Blackwood Common, that desolate area bordering the Ashford estate." The name Ashford struck Miss Marple as significant, particularly in light of the London theft. She knelt beside the cupboard, her trained eye catching details that the official investigation might overlook. Caught in the splintered wood was a thread of green wool, coarse and sturdy, and scattered on the floor was more of that distinctive pale grit, the marble and cement compound she had come to associate with their false Mr. Fortescue's workshop activities. Most telling of all was a small pool of hardened wax near the window, deep oxblood in color, with the clear impression of a signet ring bearing the letter A. The wax was of exceptional quality, the kind used for sealing important documents, and its presence suggested that someone had been not merely stealing records, but creating new ones to replace what they had taken. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "I believe we should examine Mrs. Bantry's family history more carefully. The connection between the Ashford name and our recent troubles may be more significant than we initially supposed." Mrs. Bantry herself provided the crucial link when Inspector Slack interviewed her the following morning. "My maiden name was Ashford," she admitted reluctantly. "I'm a distant cousin of the London Mrs. Ashford, though we lost touch when I married and moved away from that part of the country." The revelation illuminated the entire scheme with devastating clarity. Their false Mr. Fortescue, now revealed to be someone using a dead man's identity, had researched the scattered branches of the Ashford family tree, identifying Mrs. Bantry as either a potential ally or a convenient scapegoat in whatever property dispute he was pursuing. Miss Marple reflected on the elegant malice of the plan as she walked home through the village. The reproduction shepherdess had been merely a delivery system, designed to place stolen documents directly into the hands of someone who might have legitimate interest in their contents. The elaborate fiction of Great-Aunt Cordelia's bequest had provided perfect cover, while the public destruction of the ornament had allowed for the retrieval of the hidden papers under the guise of accident. But the theft of the parish records suggested that the scheme was more complex than simple document smuggling. Someone was systematically eliminating evidence that might contradict their version of historical events, while simultaneously creating false documentation to support their claims. The ornament had indeed fallen twice, but Miss Marple was beginning to understand that both falls had been carefully choreographed moments in a much larger performance. One that involved not merely stolen property, but the deliberate rewriting of history itself. And somewhere in the shadows of this deception lurked someone willing to commit burglary and fraud to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. The question now was not merely who had assumed Mr. Fortescue's identity, but what they hoped to gain from their elaborate masquerade and how far they were prepared to go to achieve it. The morning brought an unexpected visitor to the vicarage in the form of Mr. Pemberton, a London solicitor whose arrival cast the recent events in an entirely new and more serious light. Miss Marple, invited to join the gathering due to her intimate knowledge of the incidents, listened with growing understanding as the legal complexities underlying their village mystery began to reveal themselves. The Ashford family has been engaged in a protracted legal battle over mineral rights to Blackwood Common, Mr. Pemberton explained, consulting his leather portfolio with professional gravity. Rights that were allegedly sold in 1923, but for which the documentation has always been questionable. Recent geological surveys have revealed significant deposits of rare earth minerals on the property. Dr. Haydock leaned forward with interest. And the theft in London involved these very documents. The only surviving copies of the original deeds and correspondence, the solicitor confirmed. Without them, certain claims to the mineral rights become virtually uncontestable. We're discussing a potential fortune in modern terms. Mrs. Bantry, who had grown increasingly pale throughout the discussion, finally spoke in a trembling voice. My great-uncle Harold was involved in some sort of business scandal in the 20s. The family never discussed it directly, but there were whispers about property deals and pressure tactics. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully as the pattern became clearer. Mr. Pemberton, these mineral rights, they would have been valuable even in the 1920s. Extraordinarily so. The original sale was conducted under circumstances the family maintained were fraudulent. An elderly gentleman pressured into signing documents he didn't fully understand. Inspector Slack's timely arrival brought the revelation that completed the entire picture. We've identified our false Mr. Fortescue, he announced. His real name is Arthur Blackwood, great-nephew of the man who originally purchased those mineral rights from the Ashford family. The family connection illuminated everything with devastating clarity. Arthur Blackwood had spent decades believing himself the rightful heir to a fortune built on what he maintained were legitimate business dealings. When legal challenges intensified and the mineral deposits were discovered, he had embarked on his elaborate deception. Miss Marple rose and walked to the window, her keen eyes studying the peaceful village scene while her mind worked through the implications. The reproduction shepherdess was quite ingenious. She observed, by hiding the stolen documents inside it and arranging for delivery to Mrs. Bantry, he created a situation where she would appear either complicit in the theft or in possession of evidence supporting his claims. She turned back to the group, her expression gentle but penetrating. Mrs. Bantry, my dear, I believe there's something more you haven't told us about that letter. Something that has been troubling you considerably. Mrs. Bantry's hands twisted in her lap. The letter was sealed with red wax, quite distinctive. It bore an initial, the letter A, pressed quite clearly into the seal. Miss Marple produced the small crescent of oxblood wax from her knitting bag. Rather like this, perhaps. I found this near the church records cupboard. The effect was immediate and telling. Mrs. Bantry's face went ashen, her eyes fixed on the wax fragment with unmistakable recognition and fear. That's exactly like it. But how could you have found it there? Because, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, our Mr. Blackwood has been using that same seal to authenticate the false documents he's been creating. The theft of the parish records wasn't merely to eliminate evidence, it was to provide him with period paper and authentic-looking materials for his forgeries. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. He needed to create replacement documentation that would support his version of the 1923 transaction. The ornament had indeed fallen twice, but Miss Marple now understood that both falls had been carefully orchestrated moments in a much larger performance involving stolen property, forged documents, and the systematic rewriting of history. Arthur Blackwood had created an elaborate stage play with Mrs. Bantry as his unwitting leading lady, but his performance was about to face its most critical audience. The question now was not merely what he hoped to gain, but how far his desperation might drive him when he realized his carefully constructed deception was crumbling around him. The morning brought an unexpected revelation that cast the previous day's discoveries in an even more troubling light. Mrs. Bantry arrived at the vicarage in considerable distress, her usual composure entirely shattered by what she had finally found the courage to confess. "Miss Marple," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something else I should have mentioned about the break-in. My father's signet ring. It's been missing since that night. An old Georgian piece with the letter A in an oval setting. I kept it in my writing desk, in the same drawer as that dreadful letter." Miss Marple's needles paused thoughtfully. The same A that appeared in the wax seal on the original letter? Mrs. Bantry nodded miserably. "Identical. I was terrified that if anyone discovered it was missing, they might think I was somehow involved in this deception. But now, knowing what we know about Mr. Blackwood, or whoever he really is, I realize he must have taken it to authenticate his forgeries." The admission provided the final piece in understanding how Arthur Blackwood had created such convincing false documentation. With access to an authentic Ashford family seal, he could legitimize any documents he chose to fabricate, creating an unbreakable chain of apparent authenticity. Dr. Haydock's arrival brought news that transformed their growing understanding into immediate concern. "A telegram arrived for Mrs. Bantry this morning," he announced, producing the yellow envelope with evident unease. "From London, requesting her immediate presence regarding urgent developments in the Ashford family legal matter." Miss Marple examined the telegram with the careful attention she brought to all suspicious documents. The language was formal to the point of archaism, and the sender's name belonged to a solicitor she knew had retired years earlier due to failing health. Most telling of all was the request that Mrs. Bantry bring any family documents that might clarify the historical record. "How very illuminating," she murmured, her keen eyes studying every word. "Mr. Blackwood is making one final attempt to retrieve what he believes are the crucial documents, or perhaps to silence the one person who might contradict his carefully constructed narrative." Inspector Slack, summoned immediately, recognized the danger. It's clearly a trap to lure Mrs. Bantry away from the village, but where would he take her, and what does he hope to accomplish now that his identity is exposed? Miss Marple rose from her chair with the decisive air of someone who had reached a crucial understanding. "Inspector, I believe we should respond to this telegram, but not in the way Mr. Blackwood expects. We shall set our own trap, one that relies not on force but on the delicate art of psychological pressure." Her plan was elegantly simple. A carefully crafted response telegram would be sent, ostensibly from Mrs. Bantry, accepting the London meeting but adding a seemingly innocent postscript about bringing the original Cordelia letter with its fascinating details about the Finch & Sons transaction. The bait was irresistible. Blackwood would be unable to resist the opportunity to secure the forged document that could expose his entire scheme. As evening approached, Miss Marple positioned herself at her parlor window, her knitting providing the perfect cover for surveillance. Dr. Haydock had been stationed near the village green, while Inspector Slack waited with a constable at the vicarage, ready to respond to her signal. The hours passed with the peculiar tension that accompanies the careful watching of human nature under pressure. Then, just as dusk began to deepen the shadows along the lane, a figure emerged from the copse bordering the old footpath. Arthur Blackwood moved with the furtive caution of a man who knew he was hunted but believed himself still capable of turning the tables. Miss Marple observed his approach with the detached precision of someone reading a story written in human behavior. His hesitation at Mrs. Bantry's gait, the way his hand instinctively reached into his coat pocket, the quick, darting glances that spoke of heightened anxiety, all revealed a man cornered by his own deceptions, but still dangerous in his desperation. The ornament had indeed fallen twice, but Miss Marple now understood that both falls had been merely the opening moves in a much larger game of psychological chess, one that was about to reach its critical, final moves. Arthur Blackwood's approach to Mrs. Bantry's cottage carried the careful deliberation of a man who believed himself still in control of his elaborate deception. Miss Marple observed his progress from her strategic position, noting the way his confidence seemed to falter slightly as he noticed the unusual number of lighted windows in the village that evening. When he reached Mrs. Bantry's front door, however, it was not the nervous widow he expected to find, but Miss Marple herself, opening the door with the gentle courtesy of a hostess welcoming an expected guest. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood," she said with perfect composure, using his real name with the quiet authority of someone who possessed all the facts. "Do come in. We've been having such an interesting discussion about family history and the curious ways that truth has of revealing itself." The effect on their visitor was immediate and profound. The confident facade he had maintained throughout his masquerade as Reginald Fortescue cracked visibly, revealing beneath it a man whose desperation had driven him far beyond the bounds of reasonable action. In the lamplight of Mrs. Bantry's sitting room, he could see Inspector Slack seated with his notebook ready, while Dr. Haydock occupied the chair by the window, with the quiet alertness of someone prepared for any eventuality. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting needles beginning their familiar rhythm as she regarded their visitor with the gentle attention she brought to all puzzles of human nature. On the table beside her lay an envelope sealed with red wax, its surface bearing the clear impression of the letter A in an oval setting. "I believe you were expecting Mrs. Bantry to respond to your telegram," she observed mildly. "Such a thoughtful invitation to London, though I'm afraid the solicitor you mentioned retired some years ago due to failing health. Rather like Finch and Sons, who closed their doors in 1935. Well before any recent repurchase of Great-Aunt Cordelia's treasures could have occurred." Blackwood's composure began to unravel with the methodical precision of a carefully woven fabric coming apart. His eyes fixed on the sealed envelope with a mixture of desperate hope and growing dread, while his hand moved instinctively toward his coat pocket, where Mrs. Bantry's stolen signet ring lay hidden. "The details, you see, always tell the true story," Miss Marple continued with devastating gentleness. "The pale grit from your workshop that appeared in both the church hall and at the scene of Mrs. Bantry's break-in. The precision with which the felt ring was cut to destabilize the shepherdess just enough to ensure its destruction at the proper moment. The oxblood sealing wax that matched not only your forged documents, but also the authentic seal you stole to legitimize them." She paused to examine a stitch in her knitting before continuing. "What puzzles me most, Mr. Blackwood, is why you chose such an elaborate method. If your family's claim to the mineral rights was legitimate, surely there were legal avenues to pursue without resorting to theft and deception." The question struck at the heart of his carefully constructed justifications, and Arthur Blackwood's remaining composure shattered entirely. "Legal avenues?" He laughed bitterly, his cultivated accent slipping to reveal the harder edges beneath. "Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up knowing your family was cheated out of a fortune? Harold Blackwood paid fair market value for those mineral rights, but the Ashfords had lawyers, influence, connections. They rewrote history to suit their purposes." Miss Marple's needles paused thoughtfully. "And so you decided to rewrite it again? By stealing the original documentation, creating elaborate forgeries, and attempting to implicate an innocent woman in your deception." "I was correcting an historical injustice," Blackwood insisted, his voice rising with the passion of long-held grievance. "The reproduction shepherdess was merely a delivery system, a way to place the evidence where it belonged with someone who had legitimate interest in the truth." "But Arthur," Miss Marple said with gentle finality, "legitimate claims don't require stolen signet rings to authenticate them." The ornament fell twice, once to reveal its false nature and once to expose yours. "You created an elaborate performance, but like all deceptions built on stolen foundations, it was doomed to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions." Inspector Slack rose from his chair with quiet authority. "Arthur Blackwood, I'm arresting you on suspicion of burglary, theft, forgery, and conspiracy. To defraud?" The evidence we've gathered from your workshop, combined with the stolen items found in your possession, provides quite a complete picture of your activities. As the constable stepped forward to take Blackwood into custody, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of the situation. A man who might have had legitimate grievances against historical injustices had destroyed any chance of legal vindication through his criminal actions. His elaborate scheme had achieved nothing but the confirmation that his family's claims were as questionable as the Ashfords had always maintained. The ornament that fell twice had indeed revealed more than anyone could have anticipated. Not just the false nature of a reproduction shepherdess, but the hollow foundation of a century-old obsession with imagined wrongs and the dangerous lengths to which such obsessions could drive otherwise intelligent people. The search of Arthur Blackwood's cottage continued through the night, revealing the full extent of his elaborate deception. By morning, Inspector Slack arrived at Mrs. Bantry's cottage with the satisfaction of a man who had finally untangled a particularly complex knot. "We found everything," Inspector Slack announced to the assembled group in Mrs. Bantry's sitting room. The missing base of the shepherdess was hidden beneath coal in his scullery, still containing the stolen documents sealed with that distinctive red wax. "Your father's signet ring, Mrs. Bantry, along with several other items from the London theft." Most revealing of all was his workshop, a complete forger's operation with period papers, sealing materials, and detailed notes documenting his research into the Ashford family history. Miss Marple's needles clicked with quiet satisfaction as each piece of evidence confirmed her careful observations. The pale grit she had noticed, the precision of the felt ring, the anachronistic details in the forged letter, all had told their story of systematic deception to those willing to listen. Mr. Pemberton, the London solicitor, provided the final vindication. The recovered documents include the complete original transaction records from 1923. Harold Blackwood's purchase of the mineral rights was entirely legitimate, properly witnessed, fairly priced, and legally recorded. The geological surveys of that era simply couldn't detect what modern technology has revealed. There was no fraud, no coercion, merely the unfortunate reality that neither party could have known the true value of what lay beneath the ground. Mrs. Bantry, who had sat quietly throughout these revelations, finally spoke with the voice of someone emerging from a long nightmare. All those years he spent believing his family had been wronged. How does one become so consumed by imagined injustices? Miss Marple paused in her knitting to consider the question with characteristic gentleness. Human nature has such curious ways of protecting itself from uncomfortable truths, my dear. Arthur Blackwood grew up believing his family had been cheated, and that belief became more important to him than any evidence to the contrary. When we invest our identity in being victims of injustice, we sometimes become incapable of accepting that the injustice might have been imagined. Dr. Haydock's subsequent conversation with the prisoner revealed the true scope of Blackwood's obsession. This had not been his first attempt to vindicate his great-uncle's memory. There had been other incidents over the years, other efforts to locate and destroy documentation that contradicted his version of events. The discovery of the valuable mineral deposits had simply provided the final motivation for his most ambitious and criminal scheme. Inspector Slack's final report painted a picture of sophisticated psychological manipulation. He studied Mrs. Bantry's circumstances carefully before crafting his approach, her financial difficulties, her isolation, even her social connections. The mysterious benefactor, the family heirloom, the charity auction, all designed to make her either complicit in legitimizing the stolen documents or a convenient scapegoat if the scheme was discovered. Mrs. Hartnell, who had carried the burden of believing her clumsiness had destroyed a precious heirloom, found particular relief in the revelation. "Then it truly wasn't my fault?" "My dear," Miss Marple assured her with a gentle smile, "you were simply the breeze that a carefully balanced weather vane was already waiting for. The ornament was designed to fall. Your bump merely provided the convenient moment." As the days passed, St. Mary Mead gradually returned to its peaceful rhythms, though with a deeper appreciation for the complexity that could hide beneath innocent appearances. Mrs. Bantry's signet ring was returned, along with the genuine Royal Worcester shepherdess that Blackwood had kept as insurance. The parish records were restored to their proper place, this time secured with a more reliable lock. Mrs. Clement organized the return of normalcy with characteristic efficiency, while Mrs. Price Ridley found herself with considerably less to gossip about, though she made the most of what remained. Even young Tommy Bond, whose cricket ball had inadvertently triggered the first near fall, resumed his games with the resilient adaptability of childhood. In the quiet of her garden that evening, Miss Marple reflected on the curious case that had disrupted their village tranquility. The ornament had indeed fallen twice, once to reveal its false nature through Mr. Fortescue's expert examination, and once to expose the elaborate web of deception surrounding it. But in its destruction, it had served a purpose its creator never intended, demonstrating that truth, like authentic craftsmanship, possesses a durability that no amount of skillful forgery can replicate. "It is always the small details that reveal the larger truths," she murmured to herself, her needles clicking in their familiar rhythm. The grit that doesn't belong, the wax that appears where it shouldn't, the historical inconsistencies that speak louder than any proclamation of authenticity. Arthur Blackwood understood antiques well enough, but he never truly understood that the most important authentication comes not from seals and documents, but from the consistency of truth itself. Dr. Haydock, passing on his evening rounds, paused at her gate. "You've the look of someone who's finished a particularly complex pattern, Jane." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with quiet satisfaction. "Indeed, Doctor. Though I suspect our peaceful village will provide another puzzle before too long. Human nature, after all, repeats itself with remarkable consistency, in small deceits and large justifications, in carefully constructed facades, in the inevitable moments when truth breaks through." As the last light faded over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to go inside. The ornament that fell twice had taught them all a valuable lesson. That deception, however elaborate, ultimately serves truth by revealing the hollow foundations upon which false claims are built. And in the gentle rhythms of village life, where keen observation met human understanding, justice would always find its quiet way to the surface. The case was closed, the village restored, and Miss Marple, ever watchful, ever understanding, continued her patient observation of human nature in all its fascinating and sometimes dangerous varieties.